In relation to other kinds of ecosystems, forests require rainfall, and a lot of it. Here in the Northwest, particularly with our resident weather systems, rain is funneled into the Northwest region from the fall through the spring. And that rain comes as rain, but also as mist and a lot of fog. And as that fog moves through the millions of needles of our conifer forests, that fog is actually captured by the texture of those needles and drops as rain. Here we have a dug fir branch that is collecting drops of rain out of the fog. For example, here in our Bull Run watershed in the Cascades east of Portland, about a third of the rainfall is attributable to needle drip. If there were no conifers there, rainfall would decrease by about a third. In the coastal strip, what you've got is easily half of the rainfall is attributable to needle drip, and that would be the Sitka spruce forests in the coastal strip further north, and the redwood forests further south. And in fact, in Northern California, you can pretty much map where the fog goes on a routine basis by looking at the distribution of the coast redwood tree. And they go way, way inland in some of the valleys where there's a lot of fog and needle drip. If you basically look at a plot where mean annual temperature from minus freezing at 0 Celsius up to 30, which is quite warm, on from 39 to 157 inches of rainfall. At the very low end of rainfall, we've got deserts where basically evaporation exceeds precipitation. In an intermediate zone of ecosystems in terms of temperature and rainfall, we have grasslands, and of course they overlap with both deserts and forests. Finally, this last array of blobs is all related, I shouldn't say all, is mainly related to forested ecosystems. You'll notice they go out into much higher levels of rainfall, particularly the tropical forests, very high rainfall required at the higher temperatures. And you've got overlap among these, and the deciduous conifer distinction is not only a matter of amount of rainfall, but its timing. And then finally, we have the Arctic and alpine tundra down here at the extremely cold levels, where basically it amounts to a desert-type condition because living things require liquid water. And if it's frozen, it doesn't do particularly plants any good at all. Actually, if you take a transect across the United States at the 39th parallel, you'll see that the air masses coming in from the west deposit a lot of rainfall on both the coastal mountains and up here in Oregon and the Cascades. You've got a dry rain shadow to the east. The Rockies get a mix of moisture coming in from the west and up from the Gulf. Again, the rain shadow with dry land. And then finally, as you get into the East Coast, you'll notice there's a contrast. We've got conifers here in the west, and in the east, we've got dominant deciduous forests. And that's basically due to the distribution or timing of the rainfall throughout the year. Fundamentally, deciduous trees require summer water. And in the absence of summer water, they get outcompeted by conifers. And so here in the west and down into California, as well as up here in the Pacific Northwest, that long summer drought is what biases our forests toward conifers. Here we have Detroit, Oregon's rainfall just over the ridge of the mountain from the Opal Creek area. And you'll notice major rainfall, well, actually beginning in the fall. September, particularly November and December, very high. January, February, dropping off a bit in the spring. And finally, June, low. But July and August, these extremely low levels of rainfall basically mean that deciduous trees in the Cascades live in places where there's water from some other source. A stream bringing water in, a lake, a wetland, or something of that sort. Because the deciduous trees can't really get through this long dry period effectively. By contrast, by the time you're in the Midwest or on the East Coast, look at the distribution of rainfall. The summer months are peak rainfall, and that's mainly as summer thunderstorms. And that high level of rainfall then gives a competitive advantage to the deciduous trees. And in the Midwest and the East, we have deciduous forests dominating, such as this is actually a true white birch in Minnesota. Here in Oregon, compounding things as well, we have the crest of the Cascades. Here I'm standing on South Sister and Middle and North Sister out here. The clouds pile up to the west and deposit enormously more rain. That gives us our Douglas fir and hemlock dominated forests on the west side. And by the time you get to the rain shadow on the east side, you end up with ponderosa pine. And I'll be contrasting those forests later. Now, in addition to rainfall and a good quantity of it, another thing that trees need to grow at any kind of reasonable size is soil. This natural bonsai is a Jeffrey pine that grew on Sentinel Dome for over 900 years, and it's only 30 feet tall. And you can, in fact, well, once you get up here, if you stand right here, you can literally put your arms around it. It's not all that big. And basically, soil ends up being a really fundamental source to support a forest ecosystem. And you require not only a reasonable depth and amount of soil, but you require a really substantial array of ecological processes going on in that soil to support a forest. And when I'm talking about biodiversity, I'll be talking about that in a little more detail. Now finally, another major feature of our environment that shapes our forest ecosystems is fire. Fire has been a natural part of the ecology of forests, and trees have evolved to cope with fire in a whole variety of ways. Some resist it, some just reproduce afterwards and die from it. But fire and its timing and intervals are powerful forces that affect our forests. And I think there's a really important misconception about fire that is widely kind of promulgated by people saying this fire covered this many thousands of acres, and then they show you pictures of the huge flames like we just saw, and then they show you pictures of destruction like this. And yeah, the forest as we know it has been changed, but I don't really view it as destruction. But you get pictures like this of where the fire's gone and they tell you it covered these many thousands of acres. In reality, typically, your typical fire will actually only burn about half the area inside the fire lines. Even in that very intense Yellowstone fire where the wood on the forest floor was so dry that it was drier than the kiln-dried lumber you'd find in your local lumber yard. The fire burned day and night. In Yellowstone, believe it or not, the fires of '89, literally the fire lines covered half the area of Yellowstone National Park. Okay? And then, so according to my very, very kind of seat of the pants, rough cut model, that would mean that a quarter of the park saw some fire. And half of that would have been crown burn. So half of a quarter is an eighth, which is 12.5%. When they looked at the aerial photographs of the park after the fire, between 15 and 16% had crown burned, even under those extraordinary and severe conditions. So this kind of thing is really only a very small part of the total landscape. Much of the fire escapes being burned. This is up in the Quinault area, and it's a research natural area. You can see a lighter green here. This is an area that burned over 100 years ago. The more scraggly bluish greens here are old growth. This area did burn, and you can see it's lighter. And of course, this is no longer current forest because it's tree plantations. It's a clear cut. And if you look at old growth, like in this area here, this is what you see. Just magnificent, huge trees, nice abundant foliage, yet these trees were in the line of fire between 100 and 200 years ago when the major fires in this area last burned. In Westside forests, fires are 1 to 200 year intervals, very long intervals, and one of the major things that Douglas fir trees do is basically resist being burned or resist being killed or dying because of a fire. One of the things that helps over here on the right is the fact that because of shading and other factors, and even past fires, the lowest branches die, and these first branches up in this Douglas fir are commonly 120 to 170 feet up in the air. Makes it very hard for a fire to ignite the crown of this old growth tree. Douglas firs also have very, very thick bark. Somebody cut into this Douglas fir tree in the 1989 it burned in the 1989 silver fire. Somebody cut into it subsequent to the fire. The tree literally was in flames on its surface. The bark is charred quite deeply. But yet, I came by about a year later, and they cut into the cambium, the living layer between the bark and the interior wood of the tree, and you can see the tree working to heal this wound that was cut into it. This cambium is fully alive right here. That's alive. It's beginning to heal this wound. And so, although the tree was literally in flames, it survived just fine. And a matter of fact, there was a lot of controversy over what the Forest Service defined as a dead tree from that fire. They went in and salvage logged large numbers of, quote, defined dead trees. And I actually went in as they logged and looked at the stumps. And in fact, because it took them a number of years to actually log these officially dead trees, they had actually grown more in the last 3 years than in the last decade. They were very much alive. They'd lost a lot of their crown, but they still had enough foliage to keep going. And the key, of course, is that they had no competition for water because the fire cleared the ground for them. The fire released a lot of nutrient, which helped the trees. And so the fire actually is an important natural part of the ecology of these forest ecosystems. And we particularly try to eliminate it at our peril. There's a lot of evidence of fire. Here's a western red cedar. Because of their thin bark, it very easily kills that cambium layer, as occurred here. And the tree actually was burned earlier and started to heal in this area. Well, actually, let's go over here. Here's the first fire. It worked to heal. The fire, a second fire came through and killed this healing part of the tree. And here we have a wound healing process occurring in the present time. And basically, the tree keeps growing out where it's alive, and then the edge grows in. And so it grows like that until finally those edges will meet, squeeze out the bark, and seal the tree off and make it whole around its entire outer perimeter. So, right here, this tree is working to heal this earlier fire scar and its wound as well. Here's actually a cedar that fell down that I cut off and could actually sand the core off of. You can see the tree grew very rapidly. A lot of it was apparently killed in the fire. You've got a fire scar right here. Really slow growth right after it, but you can see the tree working to heal, and this would ultimately come around if the tree had managed to live long enough. Here is a log, or basically a chunk of a tree that was laying on the ground from some trail work. You can see where the edges have met, begun to squeeze out the bark, and you've got charred wood back in here that have been healed over. So trees, in this case, this is a hemlock. That earlier one was a western red cedar. Both have thin bark and are fairly easily fire scarred by the heat of a fire in a local place. Another solution trees have to evading being killed or eliminated by fire are the serotinous cones. And that's another major category of fire adaptation. Instead of resisting the fire, the tree ends up not evolving the adaptations to avoid being killed by the fire, but instead an adaptation to seed back in new trees after the territory has been cleared by a fire. Serotinous cones are particularly developed by knobcone pine in the southwestern part of Oregon and by lodgepole pines on a much broader scale throughout the Northwest and out into the Rockies. These serotinous cones, in fact, I should go back. The serotinous cones are sealed by wax that basically keeps the cone from opening up and releasing seeds until it's exposed to the heat of a fire. And after the fire melts that waxy material, the cones open up, reseed the ground with new seeds and trees, and the parents can replace themselves. So rather than resisting the fire, they just take advantage of it as a reproductive event. I probably should include one more shot here, but literally the ground can be covered by thousands of trees per acre, such as happened in Yellowstone after their fire. It's just absolutely thick with lodgepole pine trees. Now, kind of a variation on this theme is our east side fires. When you get down into the rainfalls that are 30 inches and below, east of the Cascades, you end up with ponderosa pine trees being the dominant forest tree. Ponderosa pine trees survive at these and do well at these lower water levels, but they do it in a very dispersed kind of way. And the thing that helps keep them dispersed is the fact that the big trees resist fire, and this low-level ground burn, which is common to the east side, burns the ground. It's carried by grass, carried by the needles that are underneath the tree, and with the frequent fires that occur with lightning and so forth on the east side, little tiny ponderosa pine trees get thinned out. Basically, the grass carries the fire, and particularly the needles under the trees carry the fire. And because the needles under the trees carries the fire, the trees don't grow competing trees under them as long as they're alive and shedding needles. When they die, they get replaced because fire doesn't burn there. So it's really an amazingly elegant system where fire thins the forest naturally and leaves you with nice, widely dispersed stands of ponderosa pine. Just, I get chills as I even think and talk about it. It's so amazing and neat. And in fact, if you look back at the 1937 survey of H.J. Andrews, after whom the H.J. Andrews Forest east of Eugene is named, these are square mile sections. And obviously, fire moved through this area. And you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 square miles, but look at the minute portion of these 4 square miles that actually was crown burn. Those little tiny red patches, that's all. Yet you have ponderosa pine forest through most of that area. Now, in a more west side scenario, a much higher percentage of that landscape would have burned. But instead, ground burn occurred broadly in that area, but it didn't get into the canopy. And of course, let me just quickly go into some of the things we're doing to fire now. Grazing on the east side eliminates the grass that carries fire. This area has been grazed. This is actually a line laid by a drip torch during some experimental burning that was done on the Umatilla National Forest. No, it's the Walla-Whitman National Forest. And what you've got here is a line where the fire was dropped, drip, 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 burning drips of combination of diesel fuel and gasoline, and it burned just a little bit, but didn't get anywhere. Where it went through the conifer needles from these ponderosa pines, it did burn out that whole area. But the cattle grazing inhibits that normal spread of fire, and between cattle grazing and suppression of fire that used to burn every 15 years or so, we've got this very unhealthy condition very broadly across the east side forest landscape. Those young trees are no longer snuffed out. They have now begun to grow, and with these many young trees under the big trees, you've got way too much competition for water and an inability of those big trees to resist bark beetle invasions. And you also, if you get fire in here, these torch and will take out the big trees. As a consequence, instead of those tiny patches that we saw in that H.J. Andrews map back in 1937, here's a more recent east side burn. And look at the relatively high percentage of the landscape where the crowns of the trees have burned. And that basically is largely the result of the incredible energy we put into suppressing fires since 1910. In 1910, there was a major set of fires that inspired everybody working on forest management to basically stop fire in its tracks, ideally by the next day. And we've ended up really fundamentally deranging the ecology of forests that have frequent fire. Now, mind you, these fires do get hot. Here is the remains of a cook set from a friend who was camping out in the area burned by the silver fire. The aluminum melted quite completely. Here's an area of the experimental burn. You know, very fortunately, we were all in Nomax and could stand in a wet meadow, nearly a wetland, and watch this area that got pushed just a little bit too hard. And fire's positive feedback. The more it burns and the hotter it gets, the more it can burn. And this patch, they ran too many fire lines through too quickly and too close and accidentally precipitated such an intense burn that it literally cooked the sap in all the living trees, which should have been able to survive a fire. And literally the next day, the trees were split open, the sap had boiled out of them. And the sound of the fire at this intensity was very much like a jet airplane, a jet engine. The roar was just incredible. Yet, in that very place where I took that picture, a month later, here's a Mariposa lily blooming. Soil is amazingly insulating and protects like the bulbs of this lily. It protects ants, it protects small rodents, all of which contribute to the ecology of the forest after the fire. And in particular, the rodents protected underground from the heat of the fire will have fungal spores in their guts. And even though the forest soil surface may be sterilized, those rodents will, as they defecate going through the forest after the fire, they re-inoculate the forest with the fungi that it needs to keep the forest ecosystem going. Similarly, in an area that was burned, a whole variety of wildflowers comes up, a nice composite with a fritillary butterfly on it. In broader areas of burn, the fireweed comes up and provides just incredible broad displays. That last one's actually in an area after the Yellowstone fire. So we've got water and a minimum amount and its distribution profoundly affecting what kind of forest ecosystem we have. We have soil, and particularly the complex ecology of soil, which I'll go into in the next minutes. And we have fire. These are really three dominant major shaping influences on the forests we have in this region. Just a quick look at species diversity, which I'm going to be focusing on in the next part of this talk. And here we've got a disturbance like fire. And what we're looking at is two categories of species. The early successional species that need a lot of sunlight and can reproduce rapidly and often have floating seeds and that kind of thing. Small, rapidly reproducing, both plants and animals, the rodents included for animals. They come in very quickly, but then you'll notice, interestingly, at the point the canopy closes, they drop way, way down because there's now very little light and cover on the forest floor. And instead, the late successional species, the species that are capable of getting bigger and grabbing the sunlight first, end up dominating. And the interesting thing is that by the time you get to well along, and by the way, in terms of real time, herbs invade in the first decades. The seedlings and trees begin invading late in that decade. The canopy closes at 30 to 50 years particularly, maybe a little longer, but 30 to 50 would be a reasonable time frame. The full closed canopy is at the 1st century, on out to 200-300 years. The mature trees begin dying and opening up the canopy, and then you get the old growth conditions where there's now enough light on the forest floor that those early successional species come back. And the aggregate of diversity of those early successional species that come back plus the late gives you a particularly outstanding level of biodiversity in our old growth forests. And so these old growth forests that we have here in the Northwest that are 3 to 5 or 800 years old are utterly phenomenal reservoirs of biodiversity. Interestingly, if you look at mammals, the story isn't quite the same. And that is actually the highest diversity for mammals ends up being very early in an early successional ecosystem. So having some diversity across the landscape is important to mammalian diversity. When the canopy closes and you've got very little cover and very little living vegetation on the forest floor, in that young forest, mammalian diversity really troughs severely. And again, as you get more ground level plants going in your older forest, mammalian diversity comes back. In developing a forested ecosystem, a particularly important pioneering tree species is the red alder, Ulmus rubra. And red alder grows especially well on disturbed sites. It'll grow even in the really tough, difficult conditions that you'll find on an old roadbed. And partially it's because red alder actually forms nodules on its roots. And those nodules create the anaerobic environment that nitrogen-fixing bacteria require. So red alder is a major kind of bootstrapping influence on a forest ecosystem, raising nitrogen levels in the soil so that the forest can grow more effectively. Interestingly, you've got, in among the red alder, you've got Douglas fir really coming up rather beautifully here. People say, well, you need a clear cut to get Doug fir to grow well. Well, here it's growing beautifully in among the shade of these alder trees and profiting from the nitrogen those alders have been putting into the soil. Ultimately, alder is a fairly limited stature tree, and the Douglas firs ultimately overtop it, as we see here. I couldn't resist at least throwing in this little picture of Ochrolechia on a red alder tree. It's called pumpkin pie lichen because it looks a little bit like a pumpkin pie. And it's a lovely little lichen. This is actually the fungal fruiting body for this crust lichen that covers red alder. And it's what makes our red alders almost look like a white birch. I mean, they are almost white enough to be a white birch. Here's a mid-successional forest. The canopy's closing. And if we go into a mid-successional forest where the canopy is closed and look at the ground, we'll see logs that were from the dead trees killed by the fire that established this forest 100 to 200 years earlier. In this case, the main fire that established this forest was about 160 years ago. And you've got very little higher plant vegetation on the forest floor. It's just mosses, things that can live in very dim light. Here's another mid-successional forest. A little bit further along, the canopy has opened up just a little bit more. You still got mainly moss, but you're beginning to get a few higher plants on the forest floor. Ultimately, out there at 200 to 300 years, you'll end up with an old-growth forest. And old-growth forests have kind of a well-defined array of characteristics. The biggest one, or the major one, of course, and the obvious one being big old trees. 300 to 500 or more year old trees are big and typically quite old. Since the trees will have varying ages, the canopy is multi-layered. Trees of many, many different heights. The younger trees are obviously shorter stature, and then the big old trees. Now, in addition to those living features, there will be standing dead trees, or snags. And these are important structural features in terms of habitat, and they can actually last in the forest for centuries after a fire event. So you can have a tree that's killed remain standing in the forest for another 200 plus years, 200 or 300 years. And then finally, and here's the really fun one. In fact, I got to tell a fun story on Jerry Franklin, who's just a premier forest researcher and expert on our forest ecosystems in this region. Jerry Franklin was part of the initial descriptor paper for old growth forest characteristics. These three characteristics were recognized. Their fourth characteristic was dead trees in streams. And I happened to have just read that paper the day before seeing Jerry Franklin at a conference, and asked him why it was dead trees in streams when, now the standard for parameters are downed logs, big down dead trees, like these, right? And Jerry, in his inimitable, humble, beautiful way, slapped his leg and said, "Ah, shucks, it's amazing. We were in those forests trying to figure out what to find in old growth forest. We were climbing over and under and walking along these things for hundreds of feet because they're wonderful super highways, and we missed them." We just flat out, they were just like the air we were breathing. We didn't notice. It's kind of a neat insight into how even a great scientist and a phenomenal observer like Jerry Franklin can end up missing an important thing along the way. But that's the way science advances, and ultimately down logs were added to those defining characteristics. Western red cedar, here's some nice big old growth western red cedar up in a research natural area in the Lewis River area in Washington. Some more western red cedar, really beautiful giant trees. In the Opal Creek drainage, there are a pair up on Cedar Flat that are in the range of 600 years old and 6 feet in diameter. Here is a Douglas fir, and it's actually Mark Hatfield and Peter Schoonmaker. We ran my 30-inch core into the tree for Mark Hatfield's benefit. And here's a tree that is just under 500 years old. But it's not all that big. And in the Opal Creek area, the trees are relatively smaller for their age because the nitrogen levels in the area are lower because of the lack of imported nitrogen from salmon. In broad areas of our forest ecosystem, salmon bring really significant amounts of nitrogen in and help the forest ecosystem to grow more rapidly. This is an area known as the Franklin Grove in the Opal Creek drainage. Some really giant old growth tree, and we're going to kind of focus on this tree and step back out. So there's that same tree, and we're going to come in at the base and actually scan all the way up to the top. Now, up in that canopy, a lot of really important activities occurring. The berry thrush likes to live up there. The top of the tree will have moss-covered branches that literally will have humus form under that moss, and you literally end up with soil ecology going on under those moss pads, more than 100 feet above the ground. In addition, you'll have caterpillars of butterflies and moths eating their way through the conifer needles. There will be countless species of lichen, including this Hypogymnia or bone lichen. It's, again, a canopy lichen, but you'll find it falling out of the trees on the ground. And up in the canopy, a particularly outstanding lichen growing in a zone that is below the very driest tops of the trees. So it's deep enough into the canopy that it stays moist a good part of the time, okay? But yet not so deep in the canopy that it's too shaded. This is the lichen known as Lobaria, oregana, Oregon lungwort. It, in an old growth forest, is the major source of fixed nitrogen that fertilizes the forest. So literally, our old growth forests maintain fertilizer factories in the canopy, in their treetops, that help support that basic lack of nitrogen that our forest ecosystems have. So Lobaria, and this also called lettuce leaf lichen, it's an amazing combination. This is the fruiting body of fungus, roughly equivalent to a toadstool or a mushroom on the forest floor. So the body of this lichen is fungus. The green layer we see here on the top is actually a layer of green algae that is right under that top surface layer. I should actually have included a picture of the bottom side. It's white because there's enough fungus underneath that you can't see the algae. And then you'll notice little tiny black dots. In fact, let's go back. See these black dots? Those black dots are actually colonies of a cyanolichen, or cyanobacterium, that fixes nitrogen from the air. And so this three-way team, this collaboration, is really fundamental to maintaining the flow of nitrogen through our forest ecosystems. And this collaboration raises, to me, a really, really fundamental point that people miss, and we'll run into it again and again. And that is that people often think about Darwinian evolution as being survival of the fittest, truth and claw, wipe out the other guy, win at all costs, but mainly get rid of everything else. In reality, survival of the fittest in a forest ecosystem very often means not killing off, but collaborating. Collaboration and teamwork end up trumping in a huge array of cases. And in fact, the whole forest is ultimately dependent on collaboration, not fundamentally competition. And this lichen, lungwort, is certainly a beautiful example of it. Another neat canopy lichen is old man's beard, Alectoria, that just hangs from branches in an old growth canopy tree. That's kind of looking at the top of old growth trees. This low angle view of the sunlight coming into the North Fork Valley near Opal Creek gives you some sense of the multi-layered canopy. I'm up on the slope looking out into the forest top, and you'll see trees of many, many different heights. And that multi-layered canopy is fundamental to letting light in to the lower levels of the forest. The branches contain many, many kinds of mosses in addition to the lichens. Mosses are important to the forest because they absorb water and then evaporate the water to keep humidity up. And if the humidity's up, the pores in the needles can open up and let in carbon dioxide so the tree can do photosynthesis. When it gets too dry, trees have a hard time doing it. So interestingly, all that moss on all those tree branches helps that the trees are holding up there, helps keep the humidity higher so the trees can photosynthesize longer and grow better. So the moss helps the forest. Here's actually a really very, very rare lichen. Its common name is old growth specklebelly. It's a fun name. Anybody want to try to pronounce that one? Pseudocyphelaria, rainierensis, yeah. And actually, I think some of you bark people have learned about this lichen and used it to help protect areas of old growth because it's a rare enough lichen that protecting it ends up being important in relation to limiting logging. Another Lobaria pulmonaria is also a three-way collaboration. Countless beautiful lichens on the tree trunks. Sphaerophorous is a lichen that grows on lower levels on tree trunks. It's also called Christmas tree lichen. You've got these little bulbous ends that look like Christmas ornaments. Little close-up view of a Douglas fir tree, focusing on it because it's a really fundamental structural feature of our forests. Here we've got Doug fir pine cones. Pine cones, listen to that. I keep doing it. It's remarkably common. It's a fir cone. It's not a pine cone, but that's all right. But these guys look a little like mice that have taken a dive under the scales. You've got the two hind legs going back and the tail. That little bract on a Doug fir cone is a signature for this species. The needles are very much like a bottle brush. They come out on essentially all sides, a little sparser on the bottom, but single, a little bit blunt on all sides. Interestingly, Douglas fir trees are extraordinarily important for our forest ecosystems. As they grow and develop and get bigger, they become more and more significant. You've got this huge period of very high significance, which actually could even be flattened out a little more with your big live tree in the canopy of forest for centuries. The tree will die, and it can literally take another many centuries for it to decay in place, become a standing snag, and finally a downed log. And here we have kind of 3 photographs of those major life stages for Douglas fir. Here's a mid-successional fir, really vital and actively growing tip, putting on several feet of growth a year and a really good site. Here's a tree that is beginning to decline. This tree is easily 500 plus years old. It's got a dead top. It still has living branches on it. It's still putting on a tiny bit of growth every year. And in the Opal Creek drainage, it's unusually big. It's 8 feet in diameter and still going. Now, mind you, the outer rings in this tree are probably, it's taking 50 to 80 years to put an inch of new wood on the perimeter of this tree. It's growing extremely slowly. In a really wonderful, deep-soiled, water available all year Coast Range site, I've actually looked at the stump of a 8-foot diameter Douglas fir that was salvage logged, 8 feet in diameter. At the edge, out at 8 feet in diameter, there were only 5 rings in an inch. It was putting almost 1/4 of an inch of wood around the outside of that tree that's 8 feet in diameter and would have been several hundred feet tall. And it, of course, needed salvage logging, right? It was, I'm sorry, I get a little upset over that one. And then finally, as the tree declines, it can become a snag or fall and become a downed log. All of these important structural features of an old-growth forest ecosystem. Now, the thing that brings down most Douglas fir trees is this fungus, common name velvet top, Phallus schweinetzii. This fungus will get in through a wound in the root and then begin to rot the root and work its way into the heartwood, the center of the tree. And actually, if you look in the forest carefully, you'll see trees that are swelled at the bottom and then pinch in up there 10, 20 feet. And that's because the bottom of the tree has been weakened by this fungus. And it's growing extra fast to try to maintain its strength and stay up. Here's the top of an old growth tree, but this is a nearly 8-foot diameter Douglas fir. The heart, all brown cubic rot from Phallus, from the velvet top fungus. And it's only got about 8 inches of wood on its outer edge, but it's 8 feet in diameter. And that little bit of wood held the tree. Here's a tree that was only about 3 feet in diameter, and you literally only have about 1 3/4 inches of good wood on the outside of that tree. And finally, the snow load in one winter took it down. The heartwood, again, rotted by that fungus. A lot of trees stay standing, again, for centuries as dead snags. They will lose all their bark. They lose their fine branches. And here's one losing its bark. Once they've lost the bark, they'll actually rot a little more slowly if a fire chars their outer surface. Here's the top of a snag. And looking down it, here we have another much older snag acting as a nurse location for some hemlock trees. And here again, up in that western red cedar natural area in Washington in the Lewis drainage, we have some stumps and snags with hemlock trees growing out of them and taking root in those locations. While I'm focusing on the needles and the tops of the trees, there are fungi in the needles that actually help protect the needles from being eaten by insects that make them less palatable and digestible. And then, of course, there are fungi in the roots, the mycorrhizal fungi, which I'll talk about in a moment. And switching now from the snags, and we've got a nice snag there, to downed logs, and that's my friend and colleague John Villela, with whom I've taught at Opal Creek now for more than 15 years. Looking at the forest floor, the snags and even living trees fall and become down logs on the forest floor, where they remain part of the forest ecosystem for centuries. And here we have an area of forest floor in the Opal Creek area, and these downed logs routinely become nurse logs, particularly for hemlock trees. Here we have a very recent downed log. At the point I took this photograph, it had only been down for a year, but yet in that year there were already little young western hemlock seedlings sprouting and beginning to grow. Hemlock grows in a basic woody environment, the woody forest floor, the wood of downed logs, and they fairly quickly become larger and still larger. And finally, these hemlock trees, this one here is about 150 years old at this point. It started in the tree, but now in the down log, but now roots have gotten out into the soil, and then the trees really can begin to grow faster. The ecology of down logs is extremely complex and fascinating. You've got countless kinds of mosses. This actually is red huckleberry. This is actually a fungus that is Lichenomphalina, which is in the very, very most primitive stages of becoming a lichen. The fungal hyphae, you can see these glistening bumps back here. Those are clumps of algae surrounded by the fungal hyphae, and the fungus is getting fed carbohydrate by that algae. So it's the beginning of a lichen kind of relationship. Mycena is the small wood decomposing cap fungus. These guys are about 1/8 of an inch in diameter. Here's a 1/2 inch scale from some hemlock needles. And then, down inside the log and down inside the soil in the forest floor, especially if it gets a little dry where you can see the fine fungal hyphae more easily, these are the hyphae, the actual feeding and active portions of fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi permeate the soil, huge amounts of fungus per cubic, whatever you want to measure, in forest soil. And those mycorrhizal fungi are actually getting fed carbohydrate by the trees, and the fungus in turn is bringing water and nutrient into the tree. And that mycorrhizal fungal relationship is fundamental to supporting our really big old growth trees. Without it, the trees can hardly grow. The rotting wood, witch's butter, here being fed on by a slug. Here is a small twig being decomposed by a toothed jelly fungus. This is only about 1/4 of an inch long in terms of real life. Amazing array of fungi on the forest floor. Cortinaria, the whole genus, wonderful different purple colors, characteristic veil and dark fungal spores. Honey mushroom, Armillariella, nice edible. Another one, angel wings, Pleurotus. This one essentially only grows on hemlock logs, but just lovely, delicate structures. A given down log may have 10, 15, 20 or more kinds of moss on the log. And here's Trachybrium. It's a very robust very robust moss with kind of light tips. But the preeminent, dominant moss on the forest floor tends to be steppe moss, where it gets going. It basically gets ahead of all the other mosses by popping up this stem and growing a fan of new foliage each year. And here's the current year's growth. Here's last year's. Here's the years before. And you can actually dig out one of these and find the thing going back 10, 15, even 20 years. Down logs, as they decay, the sapwood is the most nutrient rich and decays first. So you end up with these caverns between the bark and the interior wood of the tree. That provides a marvelous environment for a lot of activities on the forest floor. Centipedes rove around inside there where they act as predators. Millipedes chew on things because they process living and dead plant material. They're not predators like the centipedes. Here is a fungus-eating true bug that moves around in that space and has a really long proboscis that it rakes in fungal hyphae and eats. And then finally, you've got a whole variety of holes. You know, I'm highlighting this one here, but these various holes are created by beetle larvae. You see they're kind of real size, and there's a closer look at it. It's Pterosticus is the genus. It's got a really fun common name, the Herculean groove-winged ground beetle. How's that for a nice one? And then this is beetle frass. The excrement of the beetle is left behind it. It's been chewed up, is being digested, at least partially. Other things come in and crawl through that, including termites and also worms. Here we've got a dampwood termite, also down inside that down log. Meanwhile, out on the surface, the huge amount of dead material that lands on the forest floor, including the surface of the downed log, is chewed through by the cyanide millipede, Harpaphe. This critter it has cyanide in it that it collects. It can squirt it out when it's been disturbed. It smells like almonds if you disturb it much. But it warns of its poisonous nature with all these yellow spots. So presumably predators, once they've encountered it and had trouble, will evade it. And here's a really fun one. By the way, I am using Keynote, a PowerPoint program, to create these various effects, something you can't manage in PowerPoint. And so here we've got Harpaphe down in its location on the forest floor where it is chewing on those conifer needles. The base of snags often collects piles of material that drop off the tree, bark as well as chunks of wood. And those chunks of material on that floor at the base of a snag provides marvelous moist and hiding places for a variety of amphibians, including Encetina. Also great fungus habitat, great places for grouse to feed, snails. Here's a snail that really was extremely vulnerable. It took about 15 minutes to yank its house across this little branch. Really, I was tempted to help it, but I restrained myself. In the meantime, it of course was sticking its neck out hugely, because walking around on the forest floor, we have snail-eating beetles. Snail-eating beetles, I mean, I probably need to get a really good close-up of the jaws of these guys, but they have huge teeth on them, such that could grab a slimy thing and just crunch on it and cut it up. They eat snails. These guys only walk around, you notice I said walking around on the forest floor, in order to be more armored and protected against potential predators. These guys are actually so tough that shrews that try to eat them they pop out of their mouths. They can't. Because beetle wings normally can split down the middle, and those front wings come out and are kind of stationary and stabilizing, while the hind membrane wings let the beetle fly somewhat clumsily. This beetle gave up the ability to fly in order to be more armored against potential predators. That is a spot at the base of a hemlock tree in an old growth stand where deer truffles were being dug up by flying squirrels. Also on the forest floor, we have the rough-skinned newt walking along, and in this case I happened to catch one on a piece of lobaria that had blown out of the canopy. Pacific tree frogs, again, another predator on the forest floor. Countless herbaceous plants on the forest floor. The low Oregon grape is actually old growth associated, so that it lives in places for literally centuries in the context of an old growth forest. Another basically old growth species is Trillium ovatum, the white early spring trillium. It actually leaves behind a little bulb each year, and they persist for very long periods of time. And I've seen a research paper where literally 80 to 100 bulbs were there, a new bulb every year. So that trillium had been in the forest for nearly a century, which is, again, an old growth, just flowering plant. Again, a little reminder of just how complex and beautiful the forest flora can be in an old growth forest. Among the plants you can find there is the twin flower, Linnea borealis. Linnea is named after Linnaeus, who is actually the scientist who started the two-name system of keeping track of organism names. Twin flower, basically you can see the main stem up, this branch, and the two neat little bells hanging down. Countless absolutely fabulous plants on the forest floor. In moisture places, the bog orchid have an area, and in somewhat moist places as well. Fringe cup, again, a more midsummer flower, three-leaved anemone. Got a whole series of them here. Here's some beetles feeding on the nutrient-rich anthers where the pollen is located. And here's another one where the beetle is nibbling on the edge of a petal. Geum is again a plant where petal eaters have gotten at those, but here is a really nice, more perfect blossom. Another midsummer flower, late, is your western starflower. And here are actually the seed pods for fernleaf gold thread. These almost just look like, historic urns. Also on the forest floor, not only do we have lichens fixing nitrogen up in the canopy with Lobaria, but frog pelt lichen in moisture places also grows in good quantities. And again, anybody want to guess what all these neat little black bulges are? The cyanobacterium again. And that's the part of this lichen that fixes nitrogen. Lipstick lichen, one of the scale lichens. False lily of the valley. I'm sorry, what? That's not a flower. That's actually the fungal fruiting body. It's a rough equivalent to a mushroom because it's a lichen. And like the lichen I explained earlier, this is a body mainly of fungus. The green is algae. This, to my knowledge, doesn't use cyanobacterium. It's just a two-way collaboration. A dwarf dogwood, bunchberry, beautiful red berries in the fall. They're mainly seed, but they are somewhat edible. In the spring, they're pulling their chlorophyll out, and they kind of turn these wonderful colors in the spring. And here's the new foliage. And dogwood is actually an incredible array of roots underground. Like most of these forest plants, it grows by underground rhizomes, spreading underground as a clone, but then it makes seeds to help it spread to new locations. But in a given location, if it's at all favorable, it reproduces vegetatively, just like strawberries do, for example. Well, quick last look at the forest floor. And let's just take a moment and divert back up into the canopy, where northern spotted owls hang out on branches, keeping their eye and ears peeled for rodents moving around on the forest floor. And here is a red-backed vole, which lives on the forest floor, unlike the red tree vole, which lives in the canopy. And one more meal for the owl. So this is an area which does show a classic feature of old growth, which is a lot of more ground level vegetation because the canopy has opened up. And this is actually a LiDAR image, and it shows the relatively lower density of foliage up in the canopy because it's opened up in an old-growth forest, and the relatively high density of things down on the forest floor. I'm going to skip that one. Here we've got particularly a vine maple and a lot of vanilla leaf and sword fern. Here is that mid-level intense vegetation in an old-growth area up in the Opal Creek area where I've held so many classes. Here is the wonderful, just magnificent actually. I love the way maple leaves unfurl, especially vine maple. As that leaf unfurls in the spring, it's just kind of just a lovely, lovely silhouette. And then it spreads out and becomes part of the canopy. And of course, in the winter, those leaves are gone, but the branches are still there. And while I've got that winter slide up, I encountered this red fox up in Mount Rainier, and it graciously stayed around long enough to get a photo. Again, back to the forest floor and that intermediate level of foliage. Here's serviceberry, a shrub, low tree, beautiful flowers in the spring. Trailing blackberry, of course, this time of the season and later. Thimbleberry in moister places, and particularly in moist places. Salmonberry. Again, it's a deciduous plant, and it particularly likes it where it's moisture near stream edges. Heather, heath, blueberry shots here, the oval-leaved blueberry. Just a lovely, lovely flower, orange-shaped flower. Here's your red huckleberry flower. Not quite as lovely, but very interesting and neat. And then, of course, the rhododendron. All these closely related heathers and heaths actually make use of a very special kind of mycorrhizal fungi. Some support the trees, some support grasses, and some support these heathers and heaths. Here's a quick look at actually Battle Axe Creek and Opal Creek coming to make the Little North Fork. The Opal Creek Education Center is located there, where I've taught for decades now. And in the bottoms of river valleys, you have particularly good year-round water, so you can support more deciduous tree growth. Here's some nice alders growing. And the conifers take advantage of it too and just grow faster. Flowing underground well back from the stream, you have literally water flowing in what's known as the hyporheic zone that literally has organisms in it in a significant way. And you also, of course, have that surface water. Here's actually Opal Creek coming in. Opal Creek, like our old-growth forest creeks, is magnificently clear water. This is easily 20 feet deep. Here is some more clear water, and here a shot underwater of the air bubbles being churned in to help keep that water just incredibly saturated with oxygen in this wonderful, clear, pure water. Very little nutrient in that water because the forest hangs onto it so effectively, but that cold, clear water is wonderful spawning habitat for our salmonids. This is a steelhead jumping in a Coast Range river. Here's a salmon working to make its red in the Wind River. And here is some upper reaches of a stream with its downed logs, which were actually initially identified as an old-growth forest feature. The tailed frog is an indicator species for really cold, clear water. Basically, water much above 72 Fahrenheit kills them. So when you find tailed frogs, you know the water never gets hot. You don't even need to monitor the thermometer or the water with any kind of fancy device. Tailed frog tells you the water has always been good and cold all the time. And then here's a adult stonefly. The larvae live in the streams and are good food for fish. And here's one that has come out, and I caught it on the moss. Well, the fantastic biodiversity and complexity of these forest ecosystems is really amazing. You know, we were scheduled to actually eliminate all remaining old-growth forests in this region by about 2020. Fortunately, in the 1980s and 90s, significant actions were taken to back off on the amount of logging. And I'd like to just quickly show you some of these impacts. One really interesting and amazing one is this shot out on the Umatilla National Forest And if you look, well, here you can kind of see it, but notice that ribbon of silver going down that valley? I carefully had the pilot position the aircraft so I could get the sunlight to reflect off the water in that creek valley. So this in the fall, because you've got the bright yellow fall color of the larch, taken in September. Still plenty of water in the stream being one of the headwater branches of Asotin Creek, with a number of threatened of threatened species of anadromous fish in it. Yet, clear cut right to the edge of the stream, slash burned over the entire area on the Umatilla National Forest. Actually, this one, we came dangerously close to publishing this in some way, side by side with the district manager and forest supervisor's pictures of the people responsible for doing this. In fact, I had a very interesting discussion with a senator's staff over this picture, because when I showed it to them, they looked at it and just shook their heads and said, "They never do that kind of thing in our national forests, do they?" Sorry. The problem is that when I'm doing this photo documentation, I've had, in this particular stage, I actually had my camera hooked up to a computer that logged each picture, and I have the GPS coordinates in an Excel database for where this picture was taken and what direction I was looking. So I could put a dot on the map where the plane was and an arrow showing where this picture was taken. It makes it kind of hard to say it wasn't deep within a national forest. Of course, all that logging accelerates runoff. This is the '96 flood down at the confluence of the Willamette and the Santiam. Landscape architects skillfully plan these clear cuts so that as you drive the Highway 26 east of Mount Hood, you don't see anything. Just this, you're driving through this magnificent continuous forest. You know, we were intensively logging this over many decades when private land cutting had to back off in the 70s because they were running out. National forest logging ramped up. And here we have big old growth Douglas fir falling into a clear cut. I mean, these are huge trees. Look at the side of the tree and these people. I don't have time here, but have had some amazing conversation with loggers over logging these trees. But Sam here, for example, really sees an appropriate end to old growth logging at the point I talked to him during this logging work. And also took it as a sacred trust and was phenomenally skillful in how he made sure that every one of those trees could land and not be broken up and be all good usable wood. But for many decades, you know, we've eliminated old growth forests and worked to convert them to tree plantations. This is a 40-year-old tree plantation around a Douglas fir stump. Of course, the biodiversity and magnificent complexity of an old growth forest are no longer here. This is actually a second generation clear cut. Here's the big old initial stump. Here's a log or a stump that was cut after about 100, just a little over 100 years of growth, and then here's the new seedling that's planted. So we've worked very hard to create plantations instead of the structural and biological and genetic diversity and complexity of our old growth forests. Fortunately, we have at least made significant progress toward appropriately husbanding and conserving that resource. Here's a more than 20-year-old clear cut on a ridge near the Opal Creek area. At higher elevations like 4,000 feet, cuts don't grow back well. Here's central Idaho cuts that basically in a decade period produce several 20-year floods, a 50-year flood and a 100-year flood. We mess up the hydrology when we clear cut too extensively. We've clear cut the boundaries of major natural areas like Mount Rainier National Park. And actually because of that, even though this area is extensively clear cut, this is old growth forest reserve under the Northwest Forest Plan in an attempt to promote old growth forest development in an area here adjoining Mount Rainier National Park. By opening up the forest with clear cuts, this clear cut opened the forest to a major wind event, and the wind easily blew all these trees next to this ridge over. And here's a tree clutching a boulder as it went over. One of the challenges we have, of course, is we keep trying to get a lot of wood out of our forests, but as we go to higher and higher elevations, the trees are much smaller in diameter and much shorter. The volume of trees per acre is tiny, and so to keep the same amount of log coming out of our forests, we have to log incredibly higher acreages. That's a little hidden dimension of trying to maintain the cut. Some more high elevation cuts, and this is the Pistol River in southwestern Oregon. This is actually the state mandated tree protection buffer from these private cuts, pretty minimal. Here is a piece of the Shelton Sustained Yield Unit up next to Olympic National Park. This area was actually logged back in the 1960s. The site was treated so harshly that the mycorrhizal fungi were all killed off. It's a bacterial-dominated soil, and you can't get trees to grow here anymore. And here's some more of that kind of thing, and there's Mount Rainier National, the Olympic National Park beyond it. Up in Alaska, giant Sitka spruce in places worthy, and this is a student's photograph, places worthy of national park type status, clear cut. Chris Mazur had a marvelous way of defining our IQ in relation to these kinds of things. We've solved a fair number of problems with science, but we create even more with our technology and with our political and economic systems. And the difference between those we've solved and the huge array of problems we've created is our IQ. And if you've read ahead, basically in this case, IQ doesn't mean intelligence, it means ignorance quotient. Jerry Franklin pioneered a system of logging that leaves more natural forest features behind, including down logs, as opposed to this 800-year-old stump in a classic hard-burn clear cut in the 70s. We've logged the edges of wilderness areas. You can literally define their areas from the air. The survival of juvenile spotted owls is very, very minimal. There's really no place to speak of to call home. We do have some significant areas protected. This is a trail that I teach from at Opal Creek. Here's some mid-successional forest at Opal Creek. A last look at a natural forested watershed. That is, I think, enough.